Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kathleen Britton. I am a member of the Storm Surge Board of Directors, and I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm speaking on this mic. It's not a room microphone. It's the microphone for the hub that is the media hub that is recording this. So I'm going to talk as loud as I can, but raise your hand if you can't hear me. I just wanted to give a brief welcome to everyone. And for those of you who are new to Storm Surge, we were founded in 2013 as the threat to our coastline from sea level rise was starting to become a recurring problem to our community. So to address the coastal issues of climate change, we promote science-based outreach and education, including creating original content in video format for use by schools. And in a moment, and referring to the item on your chairs, I'll talk a little bit more about a new school-based initiative and how you can help. I'd also like to welcome two new volunteers to Storm Surge. Trey Lynch is a senior at the Haverhill High School, and he has a passion for mitigating the climate crisis and marine studies. And Trey is serving as the youth representative on our board of directors. I don't think he's here tonight. But we're happy to welcome him. And we also welcome David Steingesser, who has a background in climate tech, having recently served for a few years on clean energy related to software that powers programs to reduce carbon emissions. So welcome, David. Okay, we are delighted, and you will see in a moment, our speaker this evening, Professor Daniel Aldrich. He is an award-winning author and a prominent voice in resilience and disaster recovery. He has published 5 books, including Building Resilience and Black Wave, and has over 100 peer-reviewed articles. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, CNN, HuffPost, and more. Aldrich's field work spans regions like India, Japan, and Africa, and is funded by organizations such as the Fulbright Foundation and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Aldrich is a professor at Northeastern University, where he received the 2024 Outstanding Teaching Award. And Dr. Aldrich will be joining us via Zoom, so you'll all get to meet him in just a moment. We would like to, as always, extend our gratitude to the City of Newburyport for the use of this beautiful meeting space and our Senior and Community Center, and to the Greater Newburyport Community Media Hub for filming and posting our speaker series events. Of course, we also extend our very special thanks because it is of people like you who share our mission to empower our community with knowledge needed to actively mitigate and adapt to our rapidly changing shoreline. So we thank you for all of your support and for your activism. So a moment ago, I mentioned that we have a new educational initiative which is piloting with our local 2nd and 4th graders through Change is Simple. The flyer that is on your seat gives you information about this mobile skill lab, which is sponsored by Change is Simple. So before you leave this evening, please take a moment to read the flyer and consider a donation to help us meet our goal of $2,500. The total cost of the program is $4,500, and we've had 2 very generous donations to put together a challenge grant. So for every $1 that you give, it gets matched 1-to-1 through this challenge grant. And our hope is that the success of this timely and critical educational program will expand in the future to include all of our elementary students. So if you feel inspired by tonight's topic, please visit our website and connect with us on social media as well. And that is it on my end. And thank you. And Sarah's going to patch through Daniel Aldrich for you. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, you have the
Great.
controls.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, Kathleen. Thank you all in the audience there. So I can't see you. So if you have questions, please let me know in some other way. Maybe carrier pigeon, papyrus, or two cans tied together. But it's an honor to be here tonight. My name is Daniel Aldrich. I'm a professor at Northeastern University here in Boston. And for those of you with questions or the desire for dialogue, my email address and my Twitter handle are on this front slide. Happy to share the slides with you all. And I want to begin talking a little bit about why I care about this space, this disaster, this resilient space. I'll begin with a before shot. This is an image of our old home at 6944 Canal Boulevard in New Orleans, Louisiana. That's the before shot. And here's the after shot. So hopefully you can see we had some small changes done. We had a contractor named Hurricane Katrina who came through with about 14 feet of water. If you can see that brown mark on the window, that's about 14 feet off the ground. That's how high the water went. You see FEMA came through double checking to make sure we were all out of the house. So our home, the homes around 80% of the city were destroyed in August 2005. So I went from someone not thinking about disasters at all to someone very concerned about this idea of trying to recover after a disaster. And if you're an academic and you're concerned, the first thing you do is begin to read. So I began to read, and I found really is a strange spectrum of responses. How do societies handle these kind of shocks? So a lot of the literature I found was on individual level responses. And the most common form of that is getting a kit or getting insurance or being prepared by yourself. Do you have a generator? Do you have water and food? Do you have a flashlight? Are you ready? So the idea is the government asks individually to prepare for the shock. In some places, though, it's quite different. Rather than asking individuals to be ready, the government does a lot of work. This is the image of Japan, where the government has built a 30-foot seawall around much of the northern country to protect it against major disasters like tsunami. This is perhaps the other end of the spectrum. So we have some people being told to get ready by themselves, individualizing the problem. We have some people being told the government will handle it for them. And my research is exactly in the middle. I'm going to argue that what really drives the process of recovery, what gets us back on our feet and moving forward, has little to do with us individually or the government, and is much more about who we know. The fancy word for that is social capital. And we divide social capital into three types: bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. Bonding social capital connects people who are quite similar. So family, friends, people who look the same. So if you're a fast-talking northerner like I am, probably most of your friends are also fast-talking northerners. Now, beyond bonding ties are bridging ties. Bridging ties connect people who are quite different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, race, might be from a different area completely. And these are often formed through places like churches, mosques, synagogues, schools, clubs, after-school events, the 4-H, Kiwanis, and so forth. Bonding and bridging ties are horizontal. They connect us at the same level of power. Linking social ties, in contrast, are vertical ties. They connect me and someone with power above me. That might be someone like a mayor, could be a governor. So these three types of connections, I'm going to argue, are the true drivers of resilience, the true drivers of recovery. Let's talk theoretically first about why. The first reason why social capital, these ties, matter so much is because after a major event, a major shock, a tsunami, a flood, a fire, COVID-19, we have to decide, do we stay in the same place or do we leave that area that's vulnerable to some kind of shock? Leaving is called exit, that's pretty obvious. And staying in the same place we call voice. So first of all, why would would you exit? Well, if there's been a major fire, you live in California, or a major flood and you live in Duck, North Carolina, in both those cases, it's likely that disaster will come back. If you flooded once, you can flood again. Same thing with fires. If you're exposed to fire hazard, probably your house will be fired in the future again. So leaving makes a lot of sense. It's also very expensive to rebuild, even with private insurance. Often doesn't cover the full cost of rebuilding. And there are psychological and opportunity costs for rebuilding as well. Every day that you're there, if you have lost a loved one or a pet or your business is damaged, right, it's very hard psychologically to function. And opportunity costs mean you could move someplace else that hasn't been hit by a disaster and find some new clients, new business partners, some new people to buy your product. That's exit. So why would you stay? What would get you to want to stay in an area hit by a major disaster? Well, the reality is most of us are drawn by a sense of place, the believing our friends are there. This is a place I belong to. One of my favorite stories comes from Japan. There I met an 80-year-old woman after the nuclear disaster who told me she wanted to go back even though it was radioactive in the community, and asked her why. And she said her family's graveyard was there in Fukushima. She had been raised there from a child. That was her home. And she wanted to go back and be buried there and live there her last few years and didn't care about the risks. So exit and voice, this very first stage, that is a function, we believe, of social ties, this sense of community, this sense of place. The second reason why this social capital matters is because many of the challenges after disasters are collective action, meaning they have to have everyone working together. You know, if your group called all the members in at once, probably some people might miss it. It might be only the top leadership who shows up. Same thing with a board meeting, same thing with a homeowners association. Oftentimes, not everyone shows up. But after a disaster, you might need everyone to show up, though, to clean up their houses, to get the yards back in order again, to be able to sell a home that was damaged. All of those require people working together. If you don't know each other, if you haven't worked together in the past, it's really hard to get everyone on the same page after a major disaster. But if you know each other, you're comfortable together, you've worked on the same projects in the past, you can get that collective action barrier overcome. The third and final reason we think that social capital matters is because of informal insurance. Now, formal insurance requires money, right? You've got to buy car insurance, health insurance, and life insurance. Informal insurance, in contrast, can only be purchased by investing in relationships before a disaster arrives. Imagine after a major hurricane, your house has been damaged, you need to borrow something from your neighbor, and you knock on the door, and they've never seen you before in their lives, and you ask to borrow a power tool, to borrow their chainsaw, right, to borrow some water, right? It's gonna be pretty hard to convince them that you're trustworthy. If in contrast, though, you built those ties beforehand, you can more easily get those things, aid, assistance, ideas, information from people after a shock. This is all pretty theoretical. I want to give you some real-life examples that we have collected for the papers that we write to understand how we see social capital mattering during these shocks. I'll begin back in 2017 with Hurricane Irma, which you might remember struck Miami in the early part of September. Now, those red and blue dots you see are cell phone signals. The red dots in Miami are the places that you don't want to be. By the 8th of September, at the end of the day, that hurricane will be pounding Miami, putting about 12 feet of water downtown, turning off the power, making it very hard to function. So we want all the red dots to be gone. The blue dots that we see, those are people's cell phone signals as they move away from Miami. You see people moving to California, moving up here, in fact, even to Massachusetts. So you see a lot of people did leave. Those blue dots are pretty strong. But at the same time, many of the red dots are still there. So the obvious question is, if the government, the mayor, FEMA, everyone was telling everyone to evacuate, why didn't everyone leave Miami when they still had the chance? So our lab began a research project. We reached out to Facebook, and with permission, we got information on about 1 million different people on the kind of connections that they have. And we categorized them as bonding, bridging, or linking. We wanted to know, are there ties people like them or different than them? What we found was very interesting. Individuals whose main ties were bonding, people like them. So your Aunt Mirtha, your grandparents, maybe you've got kids, right? Those family units, if all your information came from them, you were far less likely to evacuate Miami before the hurricane arrived. If in contrast, you had more diverse and broad networks, what I've been calling bridging and linking social capital, you were more likely to leave the area before, and then you would stay away longer. So even before Hurricane Irma arrived, we found that these social ties were saving lives and changing behavior. Let's look during a disaster. What happens during a major shock? Can these same ties change what happens to us? Can they help us get out and survive? So we're looking now at the March the 11th, 2011 disasters in Japan, a massive earthquake offshore, followed by a huge tsunami, massive ocean waves, about 60 feet tall, and then nuclear meltdowns at Fukushima. So we looked across 130 communities along the coast of Japan. We saw some good news and we saw some bad news. The good news was that many communities had no fatalities. No one passed away in the tsunami. Everyone evacuated. That's really good news. The bad news, though, is that in some communities, 1%, 5%, even as many as 10% of the residents passed away. That is to say, 1 in 10 is decimation. Some communities found themselves decimated by the tsunami. And the obvious question to us was, why would some communities facing the same shock have such different outcomes? So the first answer that we got talking to people in Japan was, well, maybe it's the power of the wave, the power of the disaster. A taller wave, a more serious disaster might have more casualties in the communities. So we tried that. We measured height of the wave, that's the x-axis at the bottom, against mortality casualties there on the y-axis. And the reality was there was some connection, about 0.2 on a 1-point scale, but a lot of weird examples of very high tsunami and few casualties, or moderate tsunami and very high casualties. So by itself, we couldn't explain the outcome based only on the power of the wave. So the benefit of being an annoying social scientist is I get to ask questions. So I began spending time in these communities, talking to survivors' families, the families of those who perished, to NGOs, to mayors, to governors, asking them all the same question: what do you think happened here? So I had really 5 different categories of answers, people trying to explain this variation in mortality. Many engineers argued what mattered most were seawalls. They argued if you built more concrete, you built a taller wall between you and the ocean, you would do better. The next group of people were very cynical, and they argued that politics would matter. In communities that supported the in-party power, that is to say the winning party, maybe they got more money for disaster drills, for early warning systems, for evacuation routes. Beneath that image is an image of the wave. And we've seen this already. Maybe some people thought that the power of the wave was the most important thing. Taller waves, they argued, would lead to more deaths. Also not true, we saw, but we'll keep going. Demographics. Many of my colleagues who work in academia argued what should matter is demographics. Older communities, they said, are more vulnerable to these kind of shocks. And therefore, if you have an older community, you probably have more deaths. One last argument we did hear, and I thought it was quite interesting, was this idea about social ties. How would social capital matter? Well, imagine that you live along the coast, and there's an earthquake at around 2:50 p.m., and you have about 30 minutes to evacuate your home from low-lying ground to higher ground, or you'll be in trouble. But you're elderly, you're infirm, you're in a bed. What can you do to get out? These people need assistance. They need help from family, from friends, from neighbors. What if these people survived, the elderly, the infirm, they got out, not because of their own strength or because of their own assistance, but because people helped them. They lived in communities where people were coordinated and cohesive. In fact, that's exactly what we found. Mortality was much higher in communities that had weaker bonding ties, where individuals didn't know their neighbors, they didn't coordinate their behavior, they hadn't worked together in the past. Those communities had as many as 1 in 50 people pass away. In contrast, in communities that are strongly tied together, where people cooperate, they know each other's names, there is closer to 1 in 1,000 people. So a huge measurable difference in these communities based on the strength of these social capital ties. We've talked about evacuation before the shock, we've talked about survival during it. How about the recovery process? If you have a major disaster in your community, what will help you rebuild? On this image, I put up a few of the communities along the coast, which had very different recovery times. Imagine recovery as a scale of 0 to 100. 0 means nothing is working. No gas lines, no railroad lines, no schools are open, no businesses are open. And 100 means schools are full, roads are full, businesses are operating again, and so forth. So you can see we have 3 columns. Immediate, we cover it afterwards, the immediate conditions. then 2 years later, and then 3 years later. And you see some communities go from massive devastation to complete recovery. That's the bottom cities there, Ofunato, Yamada, and Rikuzen Takata. In the middle, though, you see communities that had a lot of damage that took a lot longer to recover. They didn't quite get all the way up there. And then finally, the top three are communities that had a lot of damage and didn't really go anywhere in those 3 years. So the obvious question to us is, well, what's going on? Again, exposed to the same shock, massive devastation, why would some communities build back so slowly, others build back much more effectively? I've got a few images from our fieldwork in Japan here to show you that rebuilding. The left image comes about a week after the tsunami struck. On the right side, it's about a year later. And there's no Photoshop, I guarantee. It's the same camera angle. You see the yellow tape there on that very same utility pole. All the debris is gone, right? The street's been cleaned up again. So to 1 month, 1 year, and 2 years after the disaster in Tagajo. Now, why the white van is there, I can't quite explain. But again, we see people cleaning up things, right? People are replanting in the fields. What's going on? Again, why are we having different recovery rates? So before I tell you what I saw, I'll tell you one more story that we observed. I was traveling through this coast of Japan for about a year and a half. And I came to this village I'm going to call Coastal City, using a pseudonym here. And I noticed that a massive bridge, turns out actually it wasn't a bridge at all, it was a conveyor belt. What was this conveyor belt doing? It was grinding up the mountains that used to be there on the left side of the image, reducing them to rubble and dirt, and sending that rubble and dirt almost a mile to the old downtown and dumping it day by day. And they eventually raised up the old downtown by 30 feet. They literally raised the ground on which their community was located to make it less vulnerable to the future. Now, this conveyor belt is massive, right? You see two human beings at the front there, show you a scale there. It's about a mile long. I asked them how much it cost to build. They told me over $200 million US. Now, this is a small fishing community, not a lot of money. Their total budget wouldn't even be $10 million a year. So I asked them, how did you get the money to build this kind of massive earth-moving machinery? How did that happen? So I eventually got the story out of them. Here's what they told me. They said their mayor's best friend in the community, one of the advisors, his best friend growing up was one of the members of the central government. And within a few days of the devastation, called him and said, can you do us a favor? We'd like to have around $2 billion US for help. And what happened? They got the money. The only community along the coast to get this level of assistance came primarily because of those vertical ties. Now, that sounds really unlikely. In fact, that was pretty consistent. Those communities along the coast of Japan, those that had better connections to powerful decision brokers there, those individuals, those communities did better. In fact, they actually built back more. You've heard of build back better? Well, communities with more of these power brokers helping them do stuff, those communities supported by more politicians actually built back more materials, more assistance, and more help. So a pretty amazing example here of those vertical ties helping out after a disaster. So I've mentioned so far evacuation before the disaster. I've mentioned survival, recovery. How about long-term mental health recovery after a disaster? On this chart, I put 3 types of mental health recovery. The top row is the best. I'd call that the ideal. The middle row is more common, and the bottom row, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of. In the top row, we see a major event happens. We lose a loved one. A house burns down. There's a major flood, and we lose our business. In those cases, people who have resistance and resilience have sometimes a small dip, but they return to normal again. They're able to function, no problem. They can go back to work. Their relationships are strong. The second row, in contrast, we have that major event, death in the family, we lose a house, right? Something happens at our business, and we come back to kind of where we were a little bit less, meaning maybe we're distracted for a few minutes a day, hard to get out of bed in the morning. The bottom image, unfortunately, are what we would call PTSD. You have a major shock, you lose a loved one, you go through an accident, some trauma happens to you, and it keeps repeating, it keeps interfering with your normal thoughts to the degree when often both businesses and families may break apart because of the challenges. So we had a chance in Japan to study, unfortunately, many people who went through many traumas. This image here shows you the 140,000 people's homes that had to be evacuated because of the meltdowns at Fukushima nuclear power plants after that disaster in 2011. And we had the honor of working with many survivors and working with them, talking with them, measuring their mental health over time. We had a lot of theories going into this work. We really believed that things like health and wealth would make a big difference. We envisioned, for example, that individuals who had more money, individuals who were able to do things, maybe move out of the area, hire a psychologist, hire a therapist, change their location. We thought that those individuals might do better than middle class and poorer residents. That was not true. No level of income was protective against this kind of mental shock. Then we looked at physical health. What if you eat tofu and you run marathons, whatever people do nowadays to be healthy, right? Those people weren't any mentally healthier than anyone else who eats Dorito chips and sits around. In fact, what we found was even worse than that. Individuals, for example, who had bad physical health beforehand, diabetes, dialysis, cancer, a broken arm, or whatever, their mental health got worse. Can anyone there guess the single factor that we found that was protective against bad mental health? Yeah, I can't hear anyone's voices yet if someone's been responding. Sorry.
I don't think we have an answer for you. Was there?
Social ties. Bonding ties.
Yay! Correct. The one factor that was repeatedly protective against mental shocks after the tsunami and earthquake and radioactive meltdowns was strong social ties, having people nearby you could connect with. Okay. What about more, let's say, normal effects for us, like pandemics, for example? Does social capital matter? And I'll talk about this very briefly. And the short answer is yes. We found two different impacts of strong social ties. The first one was before social capital became a major pandemic in America, communities that we measured that had stronger linking ties got fewer cases. That is to say, in the very early stages, right, before we really had to lock everything down, those communities with stronger ties to politicians, to governors, to mayors, with more trust in their government, those individuals had fewer cases because they were following the advice of many of the people in power and authority. Then when the COVID became pandemic and endemic, and when everyone got it, or most of us got it, right? I think something like 4/5 of Americans at one point at a time got it. Well, it turns out your health outcomes also were better if you had stronger social ties for kind of obvious reasons, right? If you live by yourself, if no one's going to help you, if you're sick, they hear you coughing, they insist you go to a doctor, take that COVID test, they bring you medicine, right? They bring you food. If you're by yourself and you get sick, a lot harder to take care of yourself and recover than if you have, for example, neighbors knocking on your door, delivering food and medicine. So short answer is yes. Even during a slow onset pandemic like COVID-19, we found strong evidence that these kind of ties matter. Now, if I'm right so far, if social capital is a critical element of what we're doing, should I pause? You guys okay? I'll keep going. Okay, if social capital is a critical element of what we're doing, what can we do to build social capital in our communities? Hopefully you all recognize the man in the red sweater. Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. I heard that. I did hear that. Yes, Fred Rogers. When I was a kid, he said to me, Daniel, be a good neighbor. We didn't say Daniel, but he said, be a good neighbor. So if I asked this audience, how many of you can name the first and last names of 10 neighbors, you would all raise your hands because you're all civically engaged, socially minded people. But the reality is, in Boston, Tokyo, New York, Mumbai, most cities we've done this research in, most people cannot. In fact, 90% cannot name the first and last names of 10 neighbors. Why does that matter? Because the very first person on the scene during a heart attack and a house fire, by the way, we had both in my home, in my block here, just the last few years, that first person is not a uniformed police officer or a firefighter. The first person there is your neighbor. So we had a house fire right behind us. The neighbors got everyone out of their homes. We had a heart attack in the complex. The first person there doing CPR was a neighbor. So we wanted everyone to know their neighbors. And in fact, because of our work, Australia now has Neighbor Day. Australia has many ways to kill you. They've got octopus that can kill you. They've got spiders and snakes that can kill you. They've got kangaroos that can punch you in the face. All kinds of crazy stuff going on. So to make the country safer, Australia has a National Neighbor Day, when people get together, learn their neighbors' last names, learn to build those community ties. That's the first thing that we can talk about. The second thing is neighborhood. The image there is a block party from Indiana. I used to live in Indiana. I went a few years ago, and maybe not as exciting as the parties we have in Newburyport. But in any case, you block off the street, you bring out the barbecue, right? You bring out the tennis balls and the soccer balls and the frisbees. Actually, in San Francisco, it's much more interesting that San Francisco, in fact, will actually give you $5,000 per neighborhood to have a party every year. Why will they do that? Because San Francisco knows they can't fix every building to be resistant to the major earthquake that's coming. But they can spend $5,000 to have a party that you'll have to organize. What does it matter? It matters because if you do that, right, if you put that party together, someone's got to bring the guacamole, someone brings the chips, someone gets the band, right? All of those things require coordination and collective action. So San Francisco will actually have a fund, it does have a fund, that we help build called NeighborFest, to build at the community level these kind of ties. Third thing you see on this top shelf there is social infrastructure, the places and spaces where we build connections. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about that actually more in depth. Bottom left-hand corner is a meeting like this one. Some talking head is going blah, blah, blah. You're all in the audience maybe playing Tetris or crossword puzzles. I've got no idea what's going on over there. And people are wondering, what's going on? That's democracy, right? Civic engagement meetings, school board meetings, zoning meetings, planning meetings. We need to have people engaged. So our lab helps think through, how do we get more people to show up at these meetings? How do we make them more open and accessible? The middle bottom image in blue there is faith-based organizations in North America, in Australia, in Europe. We still have churches, mosques, synagogues that play a role. And the final image is community currency. One way of encouraging volunteerism is to offer an incentive. So if I, in Toronto, volunteer for half an hour, I, in fact, can get a $5 Toronto bill. Now, that bill will not work at McDonald's, it will not work at Burger King, it will not work at any kind of chain store. It's only going to work at mom and pop stores, at local businesses, at farmers markets, at barbershops. Why does it matter? I volunteer now more because of this currency. I spend it at businesses. They get to know other businesses, and we create what's called a virtuous cycle. All 6 of these plans, by the way, have measurably improved trust and social capital where we've worked in the field. But I want to ask another question now. I want to shift gears. I just mentioned this idea of social infrastructure, the places and spaces where we build ties. So I want to tell you a story about 2 communities in Japan that faced tsunami not once, not twice, but literally for thousands of years. On the coast there, the northeast called Tohoku, the communities are called Taro and Sumohama. And side by side, they have faced literally thousands of years of recorded tsunami, massive waves, very destructive waves. And over time, they have come up with very different ways to try and fight those tsunami. Taro built the Great Wall of Japan. That is to say, a massive concrete structure around the entire village, 2 stories tall. You can't even see the ocean from it. And in these kind of processes, we see that they have built a physical structure to try and get things done and keep out tsunami. Their neighbor, Sumohama, in contrast, built no seawall, no kind of grade infrastructure at all. The only thing that they've been doing is building drills and trust. Several times a year, they get everyone out of their homes and their businesses and their schools, and they practice running up the hill, because uphill is safe during a tsunami. And for the elderly who can't walk, people stuck in beds, they literally have pre-prepared wheelbarrows, and they get them in the wheelbarrows and they push them up the hill. I want to ask you a question to think about. Question number 1, where would you rather live? In a community surrounded by the Great Wall of Japan, or in the wheelbarrow town? And the second question for you to think about is, where do you think did better when the tsunami actually came back in 2011? Think about that, we'll come back to that in a minute or 2. Okay, I mentioned this idea of social infrastructure, places and spaces where we build ties. What are the main categories of social infrastructure? Well, my lab and I have 4 main ones: community spaces, places of worship, social businesses, and parks. Let's talk about those. What are community spaces? It might be a town hall here in America. It might be a piazza if you live in Italy. It might be a forum in Greece. It might be an outdoor concert theater in Australia. These are spaces where people can congregate, do their business, maybe vote, talk together, do whatever they want in that space. What are places of worship? Synagogues, mosques, churches, gurdwaras, shrines, temples, sacred spaces, places where people get together to divine the Almighty, right? And those places in America are pretty common. In other countries, becoming less common. How about social businesses? That would be a bowling alley, a video arcade. It might be someplace like a bar or a business or a pub. Someplace you've got to pay to enter. What are parks? Parks are playgrounds, soccer fields. They might even be a dog walking area. Why do these four categories matter so much to us? Why do I care? Here's why. I mentioned before the idea of three types of social capital: bonding, bridging, and linking. And I said bonding social ties are the most common. They connect family. People like themselves. So me and my aunt, me and my grandma, me and my kids, that's bonding ties. People that speak English like I do fast, and they're from the north, right? We're connected by bonding ties. That's pretty common. Linking ties are to me to the governor, me to the dean, me to the president. And bridging ties are built with people different than me. These kinds of places, community spaces, places of worship, social businesses and parks, they build bridging ties. And they build them awfully well, because bridging ties are pretty hard to do. Imagine that you waste your day on Facebook or some other social media process, where all the information you're getting is filtered by an algorithm that makes it look like you. So if you're a blue voter or a red voter, probably every comment that you see, most of the people that you interact with, the political ads that you get, are about your vision of the world. However, if you go to a pub, you go to a bar, you go to a restaurant, you go with your kids to a playground, the people there can have a completely different opinion. Maybe they're blue and you're red, or you're red and they're blue. Or maybe you support so-and-so and they support the other person, right? These are the spaces left in our society, a polarized society, where we can actually connect to people different than us. That's why these kind of places matter. And the first question we had was, well, if these social infrastructure facilities matter so much, what happens if we go someplace that doesn't have anything at all? A suburb, completely devoid of parks, outdoor spaces, and so forth, and we build one from scratch. That's what we did. We built one called Ibasho in a city called Masaki, up in Japan. It literally had no parks, no play spaces, no libraries, nothing at all. And we made the deal. We'd help them build this space, a converted barn house, on condition that we, the social scientists, could take notes on what happened next. They said yes. So you see the board of directors meeting, they're all wearing those vests, those green and yellow vests. And they took about 2 years to go from start to running up and running. And over that 2 years, we measured everything happening inside this place called Ibasho. Here's what we found. Individuals coming through those doors, participating in this brand new facility, they had more friends, so we call that a broader network, a better sense of place. They felt this was their home, and a sense of efficacy. They thought their voice mattered in the community. These are really big things, because the average age of our users when they're mid-70s. So these are individuals often who don't go out as much, don't make as many new friends, and don't really have a voice in the community as much as they used to. Very good findings for us. So the first thing is, yes, you can create social infrastructure from scratch, and yes, you can observe the outcomes. The next thing we wondered was, what happens in communities with more or less of these kind of places? In other words, what if you live in a suburb and it's all tract housing? No parks, no libraries, nothing at all. Or you live in a downtown area, but like Boston, it has Boston Commons, it has Boston Public Library, it has all kinds of pubs and places to eat clam chowder, right? What happens in the difference in terms of a disaster? What we found is quite interesting. In communities with a better proportion of these kind of facilities, we found fewer deaths. People were using them to connect to each other and work together. But in similar communities with fewer facilities, more of a suburb, a desert, I would call them, for social infrastructure, deaths were higher, controlling for all kinds of factors. And this is, by the way, a 2- or 3-fold difference, measurable across 700 communities. And you're thinking, come on, Daniel, this is about Japan. Give me a break. No one believes this stuff. Okay, we did the same thing in North America. I used to live with my family in Louisiana. I mentioned New Orleans already. You saw the picture of my house before and after. So we began measuring in Louisiana what happens in a community where we see strong damage from a major event, and then you as a local community decided to spend your post-disaster money on building infrastructure, social infrastructure, or massive gray infrastructure, bridges, ports, and dams. So you see this map of the 17 communities that are purpley colored, they had damage, and we're comparing them to about 20 communities that had no damage. What happens in those communities after a disaster as you decide to spend your money on different programs? This is called an average treatment effect. Don't be terrified. They're not mountains. What we're doing here is we're measuring the impact of different types of programs. Let's talk about the left column first. There are 4 different icons. There's a wrench and a screwdriver. That is representing hard infrastructure, large-scale airports, dams, bridges, big gray buildings that take a lot of time to build. Beneath them is soft infrastructure, libraries, parks, pubs, places people to get together. Local, the house means it was a project proposed by the local community. They thought of the idea, they wanted to build this. And the flag means the government, the national government here in America or the regional government in Louisiana had the proposal. Now we measured 2 different outcomes. We asked every local community there, what 2 outcomes matter after a disaster? They all told us the same thing, money and people. Money meaning income, how much money is coming in after a disaster? Are people getting their jobs back? Are they working again? And people meaning migration, who is coming back? Let's look first at the top line, that kind of bluish mountain, representing the hard investments. If your community spent all of your money building roads, bridges, berms, dams, airports, and so forth, what happens? You see there's less money. There's less money flowing into the community, and there are fewer residents coming in there. Meaning, when you build those dams, earthquakes, whatever, massive projects, you're not getting people excited about coming back. Look at the middle 2, soft infrastructure, what I would call social, and local investments. Those have positive income and positive migration. If you're investing in libraries and schools and places people get together, piazzas and city halls, people feel a sense of community and a sense of excitement. And look at the very bottom row there of state projects. If all the ideas that came to you came from the regional or national government, and you just said yes to some new seawall or berm or dam or dike, whatever, you had less money and less migration. In short, social infrastructure accelerates the recovery process. I can show you the same thing for Japan, but let's just fast forward here. Okay, let's say you believed me on large part, and you believe social capital matters, and we build it in social infrastructure. What do we need to do right now to make communities like Newburyport or anywhere else around the country more resilient? The first is data. We need to know what's going on. I was able to build a map at the national level of levels of social capital in our society, at the county level, and even drill down to the census tract level. But I could not do that with social infrastructure. There is no repository, no data set, no list that tells me Newburyport has this number of libraries per 1,000 people versus, let's say, Boston or someplace else, Wheaton or whatever. The next thing is, and we wore out the shoes of 25 undergraduate students doing this, when we were able to map a community, we literally had to send them out with their cell phones to map each library, each church, each video game arcade, each park. That's what they did for about a year. So we literally destroyed some pairs of shoes. We mapped 1,200 of these facilities, social infrastructure in our city of Boston. By the way, for complete transparency, if you look on the left side, you see Brighton. That's where I live. I raised my kids in Brighton. We're the bottom third in terms of access. Unlike Beacon Hill, the Leather District, we found incredible inequity, incredible inequality in Boston, which is, as you know, supposedly a very blue, progressive, and wealthy city. What we found was the top tier neighborhoods in our city of Boston had 3 times on average the number of facilities that my kids found in Brighton, and 4 to 5 times the numbers of places like Mattapan, Roxbury, and so forth. That meant my kids growing up had to walk further to find a library, had to go further to play in a park. We had to go further to find a worship place, a place of faith. And even to get social businesses like restaurants and pubs and so forth, we had to go further. There are fewer of those for us to go around than in those other communities. So if our city of Boston has this incredible inequity, right, I would imagine that communities across North America, maybe Newburyport as well, also have strong inequity. Meaning some communities don't have these places and spaces where we can build these ties and trust that we need. Last argument I'm going to make what we need to fix is about spending. We tracked the budgets in 3 different countries, Japan, Australia, and North America. What we found was the following. even though things like libraries, parks, public play spaces are typically cheaper than large-scale road construction or bridges or dams or ports and all that kind of stuff, 99% of the time, a lot more money is being spent on the hard infrastructure, on the great infrastructures, than on the other ones. In fact, it's 95% of it is being spent in Japan, 94% in America, and 96% in Australia. Very, very large gap between spending on physical infrastructure, roads, dams, berms, seawalls, and so forth, and things like libraries and geocenters and so forth. Okay, I'm wrapping it up now. I began by arguing a long time ago that I got into this space because of Hurricane Katrina. And I found that social capital is over and over again, repetitively, a critical element in getting through, evacuating, getting back on your feet, and rebuilding. Now, those ties, especially the bridging ties, are being built to boring, mundane places like libraries, like parks, like Starbucks. And the reality is we overlook the power of these kind of places. Oftentimes, first of all, we don't even think about the ability of these places to help us build these ties. And we don't recognize that these communities that have more of access to parks, access to libraries, access to pubs, they're the more resilient communities. They're the ones that will come back earlier. All too often, we're cutting funding to these communities, we're cutting funding to these kind of projects when things get tough. Thank you so much, and happy to have a chat.
I'll bring the mic around.
Wow, thank you so much. Can you see us now?
I still see you, but no one behind you.
Okay.
And also it's kind of blurred out
The background.
behind you.
Turn it around.
All right.
Probably not worth it.
Do you want me to turn it around? Okay. All right. So, thank you so much. I think that was a fabulous, really interesting data. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience for Dr. Aldrich?
I'm gonna pass this mic around so that the recording folks can hear.
Thank you.
Can you
I am wondering,
repeat the question? I could barely hear. There was a question. I couldn't hear the content,
Okay,
though.
Not
well,
yet.
I'm gonna repeat it back to you. That's just for the recording, so that's not amplified.
I'm wondering if there's a website that we can access from our homes to look at the discussion that you just provided us
The slides.
with all that information.
The slides.
Yes.
We'll repeat
And
it
the
for
printed
you.
information.
She's asking
Okay.
if you can provide the slides.
Can you provide your slides?
Or can he's provided them to us. Can we share them with people who attended?
Yes.
We'll send
Great,
them to you.
thank you.
We'll send
Oh, I
them out
see.
to everybody who attended.
I
We've
see.
also
All right,
recorded
thank
the
you.
episode with all the slides, so if you want to find it later, it's going to be uploaded.
Yes, and Sam Hub will also, and we'll publish that.
Art had a question?
Art?
Thank you. What other examples can you give in terms of in America where people are understanding what you've provided so they're planning differently?
Great. I heard the question. Thank you, Art. Yes. So I'll give you three that popped to my head. One is Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, Colorado formed an organization called BOCO Strong, Boulder, Colorado Strong, after they had both floods and fires there. And BOCO Strong recognized that simply building fire breaks, building new seawalls or dams or whatever else they would have in physical infrastructure wasn't enough. So the community began having a yearly essay contest for kids, yearly parties for the people to get together, encouraging all kinds of volunteerism and interactions, and creating all kinds of new associated committees to go out and do work in the communities. So actually you can find their stuff online. It's called BOCO Strong, Boulder, Colorado Strong. That's one example where they literally changed planning for fires and for floods there in Colorado. Second example I would give is in San Francisco. I mentioned they have one of their plans called Neighbor Fest. That's where the government now gives $5,000 a year to communities inside San Francisco to have that party. Again, no strings attached beyond the idea that everyone's got to be invited, and you have to have the citizens plan that work. That's from the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, NEN. And the NEN works in every community to build a disaster readiness plan, to work with school kids to get them on board. So the whole idea of the process is they don't want the city being responsible for process when they know, for example, that community citizens themselves have the knowledge and have the capacity to work together if they're encouraged to do so. So that's the second example I would give. And the third example comes from actually where I live here in Boston. Actually, it's Cambridge, right nearby. So Cambridge, actually, and I began working together about 5 years ago. They now have a yearly social capital mapping program to see where are the weak areas, where are the strong areas across Cambridge, and then they try to work in those communities. So for example, if new migrant communities that speak Haitian Creole from Haiti, or communities from China that speak Chinese, or communities, for example, that are speaking Spanish, that need help, they've now begun publishing materials in those areas, hiring individuals who can speak the languages where they don't have connections to the government, there's weak linking ties, or weaker ties to other NGOs. So they've also changed the way they do things. It's literally part of the city's plan now is using social capital as an early warning indicator. Where are the areas in town that will be in trouble during a heat wave, during a flood, if the power goes off for several days? By looking at this map ahead of time, they can say, well, look, this community is quite strongly connected to each other. They're going to work it out by themselves. They have collective action, no issues. But this community is very cold, we would say. They don't have the ties. They haven't worked together. They haven't had communications with the city. This is the area to which we need to really pre-position resources. So they're really trying to work hard now, right, and do things to make sure that the overall process uses social capital as part of the mapping process. So that would be the third. So Boca Strong, Boulder, Colorado, San Francisco, California, and Cambridge, Massachusetts.
We have another question, one moment.
Yes, thank you for very informative and very enlightening talk. I'm curious about your work. Seems to have been done a lot on catastrophes, tsunamis, things that are much more dramatic and presumably catastrophic. I'm interested to know about what the measures are for just ongoing. We all know that climate change is bringing all kinds of things that may not be quite as dramatic as to be described as a disaster, and just how quality of life is improved by improved social capital. I can guess at that, but I'm curious what kind of work you've done kind of for the more chronic situations and not the more emergency kind of disaster that you've been showing in your research.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, I've got a book under review right now that I hope will be coming out next year that in fact talks about this explicitly. So yes, in fact, when I talk to decision makers in big cities, I tell them, don't frame this as disaster preparedness, frame this as quality of life. Because the reality is, for most people, getting hit by a major tsunami is relatively unlikely. We thought COVID was unlikely also, but what can you do? But much more common would be things like, let's say, a walkable neighborhood, trusting in my neighbors when there's a small fire or a small problem, crime, right? So what we found is, in communities with higher levels of social capital, more people walk outdoors all the time. They walk outdoors in the morning, in the evening, and the afternoon. That means we have more people walking. We have less crime because there's more eyeballs in the streets. If you want to think back to Jane Jacobs' arguments, right, back to the 1960s, that we need eyes in the streets. So we have people walking outdoors, meaning they have better physical shape. So we actually have lower levels of diabetes and obesity. You see people walking outdoors and saying hello. They actually do know their neighbors because they see them as they're walking outdoors. Then what we see as another outcome is more street traffic to businesses. So walkable businesses nearby these communities with high social capital get more people coming in, as opposed to me driving into Costco, 45 minutes, parking my car, shopping there, and driving home again, in which case I skip to local businesses. So again, where you have lower trust and lower social capital, people stay home more. They don't know their neighbors' names. They don't walk outside during morning, afternoon, or night. They don't do it at local businesses as much, and there isn't as much trust in the typical local government as well. So yes, we've measured during peacetime, during non-catastrophic moments, that social capital is a quality of life improver. Where you have trust in neighbors, you know people nearby, you feel comfortable going outside, then your daily life actually changes. And by the way, it's a really cool experiment. I'm sorry to waste your time about this, but I love this experiment that you did. Philadelphia had at one point something like 30,000 unused lots in urban centers, meaning literally a lot where a house was planned or a building was planned that was never built. And of course, people began dumping garbage there, rats come there, drug dealers might go there, teenagers might light things on fire, so pretty kind of unpleasant. In those communities, walking was less, crime was higher, people didn't go out as much, obesity was higher, and mental health was worse. So the city randomly chose around 5,000 of these blighted lots to clean up. All they did was take out the trash, put in a light, clean up the grass, remove the mattresses and the rats. And guess what happened over the next 6 months? People began to walk there. Obesity rates dropped. Crime rates dropped because people are outside now. They feel comfortable walking outside. You're not going to do a drug deal if there's 20 neighbors literally taking pictures of you as you're doing it. Then teenage delinquency dropped because now there's more adults outside. This really cool experiment when literally just cleaning up a small area that otherwise might go overlooked did change all those things. So yes, we think social capital has measurable impact in peacetime, like now, when there's something happening, but also in a time like COVID or a time like a disaster as well.
Fabulous, thank you. More questions? No? One more.
Hi, Danielle. My name is Jane Healy. I'm involved in the city's resiliency committee, and we have been doing quite a bit of work, especially in the last year, with outreach and engagement with the community. And we've really seen a lot of, we've had forums where folks have really gotten to know each other that didn't know each other before, seeing new faces, and it's been really, really rewarding. But it's hard work, and it's hard to keep it up. And so, I'm loving this because it sounds like all we need to do is have more parties, and maybe that will solve some of the situation. But I wanted to go back to the communities that you cited. One had a large, like a big Great Wall, and the other one had more of a cooperative approach. And
Right.
What was the catalyst? They were close by. Do you have any insights on why one chose one approach and one chose the other?
Thank you. Oh, and I completely forgot to ask the audience, and I can't even see you anyways, but I'll tell you my answers to those two questions, and I'll come back to your question. It's a great question. So first of all, I would rather live in the wheelbarrow community, which is called Sumohama, because then I can see the ocean, and I meet my neighbors regularly because we have these drills, and I trust them, right? If I'm elderly, I'm in the wheelbarrow and so forth. And when the tsunami actually did arrive in 2011, Sumohama, with no seawalls, had a lower mortality rate than the one with the Great Wall of Japan, because people could not see the tsunami coming with the seawall there, and they went to the top of the seawall to look over it, or they didn't think they had to evacuate, because why evacuate? And unfortunately, they were overtopped. The water came over the top of it and crushed the seawall, and then many people passed away. So yes, why did they have that? I would say it's because they had a local champion. And this has been a pretty consistent theme we've found in social science. For ideas to survive, as you mentioned, is hard work. It takes time, right? It's not going to, you can't just have one meeting about it and something can happen the next day. You need to have a consistent person in organizations, whether it's City Hall, for example, or an NGO or a private business, who's there over not 1 year or 2 years, but often over a decade to push over and over, hey, how about doing this thing? So they convinced each other. First, we had one champion who pushed it harder. They did visits to other communities that did and didn't have seawalls to see what it would be like. So they had sort of study tours and almost. They really thought about it a lot. And they were one of the few communities in Japan. Out of the 140 that I visited, I think only 2 or 3 don't have seawalls. So most communities followed the pack and said, look, we think we'll be safer. We're going to build the seawall. Government will pay for part of it, right? What's the big deal? But what we found was most of those seawalls didn't survive contact with the wave. They were destroyed. And because evacuation rates were lower, where you had the seawall, it was almost like a moral hazard, we call it in economics. A moral hazard meaning it negative change of views. So yes, a champion there pushing this idea over and over again. I can just tell you, there's an organization in Australia called Resilient Ready. I've known a woman there named Renee Hanvin for a decade now. A decade ago, no one had heard of social capital in Australia, nobody. And she took this idea I'm telling you all about tonight, and for a decade, she has said the same thing over and over, and I wish I could say over and over and over and over, for like 10 years. This last year, she finally got $1 million from the government of Australia to try and prove that she's right, that these social capital really does matter. After 9 years of being ignored, finally they took her seriously. So it took a long time to go from, here's an idea, this should work, we have evidence from other communities, other societies, other times. Status quo is very powerful, inertia is very powerful, and political capital, political will is often very weak. So you need that champion there for the long term to push. This idea sounds radical, but here are all the benefits we get from it.
Are we good? Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Did you have the raffle?
Right, we have a raffle. So, where is the, is this it?
Yes, that was.
So we promised you, so your book.
Woo!
We promised everyone who registered for the event ahead of time that we would raffle off a copy of your book. So,
Wow.
We got more people registering in advance than ever before.
right.
So the winner is Sherry Melto.
Congratulations.
Sherry Melto runs our climate cafe with kids. It's a great program. So,
Super cool. Congratulations. Thank you for getting the book.
okay. So, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you again, Professor Aldrich. Very much enjoyed. And thank you also. We're going to have the slides, make the slides available as well.
Can you share your slide that has your books on it, Daniel? There was a question about which are your current books. Do you still have your slides handy?
Yes, hold on 1 second. So you want to see the slides again? Hold on.
Just the slide that has
try and share
your
again.
books at the beginning? That lists.
Yeah. Okay, where's my share screen button here? Share screen. That one. Is that visible?
Yes.
Yep.
There you go. Perfect.
There they are. Yes.
Can you ask Dan if he has a guidebook for what communities can do next?
The question is, do you have a guidebook for what communities can do next?
Yes, the book here on the right side, that's called Communities After Disasters. We published that at the Institute of Medicine. That book is literally a how-to kit with many, many, many examples from around this country and other countries to show how communities have tried to build, as it says, healthy, resilient, and sustainable communities. That is literally a how-to guide, and in fact, it's free. There's no money coming to any of us. It's online, so you can search for it at the IOM, the Institute of Medicine. That book is a fantastic guide for local and regional governments to try it out.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
There's plenty of cookies.
Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Take care. Thank you.